So good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. Special thank you to my good friend, Congressman Cliff Bentz from the great state of Oregon. Thank you, Cliff, for co-hosting today's forum and to discuss what I'll call the mismanagement of the northern spotted owl. That's a topic that truly does hit home to both of our districts and both of our states. I look forward to a robust conversation today surrounding forest and species management. Habitat for the northern spotted owl is largely seen in areas such as California, Oregon, and Washington. If you recall, in the 1990s, the United States Fish and Wildlife Services listed the northern spotted owl as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the ESA. Under this listing, Fish and Wildlife Services designated 6.8 million acres as critical habitat. And just for comparison, that is roughly the size of the state of Hawaii. In 2012, Fish and Wildlife Services took the owl's critical habitat designation even further, designating 9.5 million acres as critical habitat. This included 1.1 million acres of federal land that is not critical habitat for the owl. The Obama administration's designation decimated the timber industry in Washington and Oregon. The amount of timber harvested from the National Forest System land went from 4 billion board feet in 1990 to just 687 million in the year 2020. Resulting in an annual loss of over $66 million in worker earnings, killing at least 1,200 jobs in the region, and taking away critical revenues that local counties use for things like schools and hospitals. Far too often, the Endangered Species Act has been weaponized at the expense of industry and the jobs that industry provides for the West's rural communities. One of the greatest threats to the northern spotted owl continues to be that of wildfire, which has decimated millions of acres of critical habitat for the owl. It is no coincidence that catastrophic wildfires are on the rise in the US. Currently, the US Forest Service is carrying out just 2% of the needed fuel reduction treatments per year. In 2020, California, Oregon, and Washington lost over 5 million acres to wildfire. And as our forests continue to be mismanaged, many wildlife species, like the northern spotted owl, are losing habitat. There must be a robust conversation surrounding forest management and the Endangered Species Act. The two are not mutually exclusive and must be addressed together to ensure the northern spotted owl's recovery. Further, there's a great need to modernize the Endangered Species Act. The ESA has a recovery rate of just 3%. That's a staggering failure to protect the very species that it was intended to help. And while it has failed to safeguard those species, the law has been weaponized by environmentalists with a one-size-fits-all approach that disregards communities, threatens private property rights, public land use decisions, and American jobs. The previous administration, the Trump administration, made great efforts to improve the Endangered Species Act, reducing harmful restrictions that put land management decisions back in the hands of those who live, work, and use these lands every single day. Most recently, the Trump administration finalized a rule revising the designation of critical habitat for the spotted owl, excluding 3.5 million acres in Washington, Oregon, and California from critical habitat designation. It's important to note that this rule maintains 6.8 million acres of critical habitat on federal land, in line with the best available science. Unfortunately, the Biden administration announced recently that it is delaying this final rule until December 15 of this year, and will likely be revising it once again. In an effort to highlight the devastating effects this decision will have on the region, my good friend, Representative Bentz, led a letter with several other Western members outlining the double standards the Biden administration's Department of the Interior continues to put forth. I look forward to having robust conversations with Mr. Bentz and our witnesses today as we discuss management of the northern spotted owl and how we can work in Congress to strengthen the ESA and ensure our rural communities do not bear the burden of bureaucrats and environmental groups who have weaponized the Endangered Species Act. I'd now like to turn it over to Congressman Bentz for his opening remarks. Cliff?
Thank you, Congressman. And before I begin, I want to welcome all our witnesses, but with a special emphasis on the ones I know quite well. Commissioner Freeman, of course, and I served in the Oregon legislature together. So, Commissioner, it's great seeing you again. And of course, Commissioner Nash and I have worked closely together on any number of issues, and I rely on both of these people's advice a great deal, and I look forward to working with, I don't know what title you have, Heath, but working with you as one of the leaders in the forest industry. So thank you all for being here. Last year, of course, Oregon experienced devastating wildfires that burned over 1 million acres of Oregon land. As a result of the fires, 11 people died, thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed, and 2 towns were completely burned up. Thousands of people's lives have been shortened because of the smoke that they were forced to inhale during the weeks and literally months that smoke covered the western end of our nation. The smoke was so bad, it actually affected the air quality all the way here in Washington, D.C. It was described as a once-in-a-generation fire, but I fear there's no guarantee whatsoever it won't happen again, indeed, and unfortunately this year. And in fact, we're dealing with such severe drought right now in most of the western United States. Most of us in Oregon, California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and the list goes on and on, are fearing the worst. One California wildfire last year burned up 1/10 of the world's mature giant sequoia trees. These trees have lived for up to 2,000 years, survived dozens of wildfires, and now in just one bad summer, 10% of those trees are gone. So why were the 2020 fires so bad? It was due largely to a combination of hot, dry winds and years of poor forest management. These bad forest policies were written many times by bureaucrats who perhaps have never set a foot in a real forest, writing policies with profound long-term negative implications. Bad forest policy has unwittingly turned our forests into weapons of mass destruction. Any bad actor could light a match in the forest and put thousands of lives at risk. Indeed, just 4 days ago, I asked the director of the FBI to look into this possibility and to make sure they're trying to will do their best to defend us against such a horrible risk. The Endangered Species Act was a well-intentioned piece of legislation designed in the 1970s, exactly as its name would apply. The goal was to recover endangered species, maintain ecosystems, and restore species populations to healthy levels. However, the ESA has been weaponized by people who see environmental lawsuits as an endless opportunity to prey on the fears of compassionate Americans and to line their own pockets. However, a huge sue and settle litigation industry has built itself around these lawsuits. They've embarked on a long-term public messaging campaign that has maligned forest management, real forest management as anti-environmentalist, but nothing could be further from the truth. The ESA has been used to lock up our forests, creating a ticking time bomb that will inevitably lead to out-of-control wildfires in future, and I hope not, but even this year. The irony, as mentioned by Congressman Newhouse, is that only 2 to 3% of ESA protected species have actually made a full recovery. It is clear that the ESA, as implemented now, is not working and is creating extreme social and economic costs, not to mention loss of human life and property. It's a lose-lose situation. The species have not recovered, and the people of the Northwest are being made to suffer for no good reason. The witnesses here today are people who know from years of experience on the ground how a forest can and should be managed. They agree that forests need to be sustainably managed so future generations have access to the same great recreation and wonderful resources we have available now that are being allowed to go to waste. Local communities and states need to play a more powerful role in species conservation and, of course, in management. Top-down approaches from the nation's capital have not been able to achieve these goals. We need to be able to have an honest, critical conversation about what policies do and don't work. Local communities and states know better than anyone how to take care of their local lands and their native species. They have a vested interest in seeing that their environments and economies thrive, and I look forward, Congressman Newhouse, to our conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Bentz. Thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize our first panelist for the day, Commissioner Tim Freeman. Mr. Freeman serves as the president for the Association of ONC Counties and as county commissioner for Douglas County in Oregon. First serving as a field mechanic for Don Whitaker Logging, he knows firsthand the negative impacts of burdensome regulations and what they can have on industry and on surrounding communities. Mr. Freeman, I want to thank you for being here with us today, and we all look forward to hearing your comments and you sharing your insights. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you very much, and thank you for not reading that entire bio. As you get older, your bio just seems to get longer and longer. So I want to start by thanking Chairman Newhouse and my good friend Congressman Bentz. I've been waiting quite a while to get to say Congressman Bentz, so I'm glad that he's there serving us. And as he stated earlier, we do have that history of serving in the legislature together, and that was a really good time in my life. For the record, my name is Tim Freeman. I am a Douglas County Commissioner. I'm the president of the Association of ONC Counties. This morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are, I'd like to take a couple of moments to go over a few points, and then I can answer any questions you may have. So real quick about Douglas County. Douglas County is approximately 5,000 square miles or 3.2 million acres. We have parts of 4 national forests here in Douglas County, and we host the largest amount of ONC lands. We were once known and continue to call ourselves the timber capital of the world. I would tell you, if you were to include Western Washington, Western California, and Western Oregon, clearly we are collectively the timber capital of the world still. Here in Douglas County, 50% of the land is owned and managed by the federal government. The Association of ONC Counties represents the ONC land in all the 18 counties where ONC land exists. ONC land is a very unique set of lands designated by Congress, and those lands only occur in 18 Oregon counties. The name's a little confusing, but those counties are in Oregon. These lands are congressionally designated timberlands to be managed under the principles of the 1937 Act and the principles of sustained yield. The 1937 ONC Act was the first conservation act passed by Congress. It's sort of interesting when people hear us talk, often they think that we're into trying to log everything and cut all the trees down and be done with it. But sustained yield is a forestry term that was put in the 1937 ONC Act, meaning you can never harvest more timber than what grows. And so if you follow those very simple principles of sustained yield, you can harvest and manage and produce all the outcomes you want forever. So just a couple quick things. First, we're a little bit preaching to the choir here. Your 2 opening statements were fantastic and stole quite a bit of the thunder of what I want to talk about, but I'm going to nonetheless go through my talking points. So the Endangered Species Act and the listing of the Northwest spotted owl really is a story of 30 years of not making it better for the spotted owl. But really it's 30 years of making it worse for everything else. So everything from the chance to go recreate on these lands, the health of the forest, the communities in which these forests surround are all worse because of the Endangered Species Act and the listing of the spotted owl. The subject of today, or the topic of today, this weaponized concept, could not be clearer or more accurate as to what's happened. The constant protest and litigation and stopping of any sort of reasonable or practical forest management has really just been, has become the normal. virtually every timber sale that's put up on ONC land is protested, just as a matter of you just do it as just as a normal thing they do, and it just happens on every single one, and that slows down the process and lowers the value of the timber and really makes it difficult for the managing agencies to manage. I want to be clear. The truth is the agencies really have no pathway to follow for success. We oftentimes want to, be upset with the agencies or demonize the agencies. It's not entirely their fault. The laws around the Endangered Species Act, the Equal Access to Justice Act, and other laws make it impossible to manage public lands. It is really a series of additional regulations and rules stacked on top of each other that I oftentimes feel sorry for these agencies because there's really no way for them to be successful. I wanted to cover the lack of fire recovery. We had the biggest fires in recent history here in Douglas County, and the most loss of homes ever in Douglas County and in the West throughout the ONC. There is a terrible situation going on the ONC that in the 2016 Resource Management Plan, 80% of the land was put into a reserve. In those reserve categories, there can be no salvage. So this wood is literally sitting on the ground and going to rot. What is estimated to be billions of board feet of timber, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of timber is just going to rot and be fuel for the next fire. We have certainly done better in the past. If you look in the history here in Oregon, the Oxbow fire, we went in after the Oxbow fire and cleaned up and replanted that. The Tillamook fire, the Columbus Day storm, another natural event that knocked down a bunch of trees. Each of those big major events, we went in afterwards, cleaned up, replanted, and have healthy forest where there was once devastation from those natural events. I like to say that with no pre-fire management and no post-fire management, we know that we're going to have more and more fires and more of this landscape will burn. And it's really important to think about post-fire management as the next pre-fire management. If we leave that dead wood sitting out there, it's just fuel for the next fire. So simply, if the BLM would be allowed to just follow the ONC Act requirements for sustained yield management, there are ways to both increase owl and other wildlife habitat and still provide the promise of economic benefit. This is not an either or proposition. We have turned what historically has been a win-win situation into a lose-lose situation. And I want to finish up by asking a question. So if 30 years ago, Congress was asked to vote on a bill that would do these things: one, cost billions of dollars in forest management, focus largely on recovering the northern spotted owl; two, cost billions of dollars in lost productivity in the way of jobs and commodities, wood products; three, cost billions of dollars in lost shared timber receipts to counties and the US Treasury. And if they would have known 30 years later there would be less northern spotted owls, do you think they would have voted for that bill? One of the hardest things to do is to admit a mistake. And we're all in the business of doing public policy. That's a hard thing to do. I have to think that Congress 30 years ago was no more or no less smart than Congress is today. The difference is today, you have 30 years of information that they didn't have. The Endangered Species Act and the listing of the northern spotted owl, by all accounts, has been a very costly mistake. But we know Congress can fix this. Thank you again for the time. I appreciate the work you all are doing. I know it's difficult. There is a solution to this, and we stand ready to help you. Thank you.
So thank you, Commissioner Freeman, and it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Nash. And before I do, I neglected to thank Congressman Newhouse for putting this hearing together. So I want to thank the Congressman right now, because I can't think of anything more important than to draw to the nation's attention the incredible risk that the Western United States is facing by virtue of this huge accumulation of wood, which I think in large part can be put at the feet of the bad approach to saving the spotted owl. But that aside, it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Todd Nash, who represents Wallowa County in the northeast corner of my district. He's had a long career in logging and ranching on public and private lands, so he knows all too well the impact that federal policies have on these essential activities. He is the chairman of the Board of Commissioners of Wallowa County and the president-elect for the Oregon Cattlemen's Association. With that, Commissioner Nash, I turn the hearing over to you.
Thank you, Congressman Bentz. Chair Newhouse, I really appreciate the opportunity here today. In 1990, there were 405 active sawmills in Oregon, with the listing of the spotted owl followed up by the listing of the anadromous fish species, Chinook salmon, steelhead, and then the infish, bull trout. 20 years of that, 299 of those mills had been shut down. By 2010, there was 106 active sawmills. The availability of federal ground had been slashed by 90%. The demand on private lands increased dramatically. Some of the private lands were cut well beyond sustainable levels to try to keep those mills active. We lost our market share in the world economy, and we saw other countries develop and take on logging practices with little or no consideration for the species therein. The lack of competition and the lack of competition and the increased cost of logging due to the shutdown of mills, like in my area in Baker County, we started to rely more on regional locations to deliver logs to. This meant increased cost in trucking, and it made islands here where people had woodlots that the cost of logging was actually more than what the product was worth standing there. At the same time, with the anadromous fish listing, we have seen on U.S. fishing or U.S. Forest Service lands, grazing permits go from 9,000 permit holders to 6,000. And the question arises, and Commissioner Freeman touched on it already, but has this helped to recover the targeted species? In the case of the northern spotted owl, we'd have to unequivocally say no. In the case of the anadromous fish species, there is some promise with supplementation of hatcheries, but we can see that the impacts from logging and grazing have had a little to no impact on recovery. The heavy-handed unintended consequences that were handed down by unelected agencies did irreparable harm. Did harm to the unintended forests that burn with such high intensity it destroy the very habitat intended for protection. It did harm to communities where family wage jobs once were created by the industry. Harm to the hydraulic functions of the national forest with unmanaged stands so thick snow couldn't penetrate down to the ground, and less percolation of water went through the soils and back into in-stream flows. And we saw more taken up into the atmosphere by the evapotranspiration. The greatest loss, though, has been the skip and generation of young people with firsthand knowledge of stewardship of these lands. People that know the satisfaction of a properly felled tree and the skill required to do so. People that grew up listening to the successes and failures of past practices. People that intuitively know the best practices for a particular piece of ground and how to manage. People that have experienced the joy, pride, and discomfort of working and camping out all week in some of the most magnificent land in the world. people that know the satisfaction of leaving a landscape in better condition than when it was entered. And lastly, providing a quality, sustainable product for the benefit of all, including those that would oppose the practices. The remedies, there are a few. One of the things we're doing here in the Blue Mountain area with the three forests here, with the Malheur, Wallowa, Whitman, and Umatilla, the last plan, the Blue Mountain plan, was scrapped. It was 16 years in development. It was 6,000 pages, and it was thrown in the trash due to so many people upset about the outcome of what that was. We have developed what we call the Blues Intergovernmental Council. It consists of commissioners. It consists of representatives, tribes, federal agencies, state agencies, and we're all sitting down together and we are developing the next plan. And I think that it is possibly a model that we could move forward. We have to move in a direction that lends toward sustainability for not only the species that we're trying to protect, but also the communities and the livelihoods of the people that live there. The 1897 Organic Act referred to forest reserves and providing for communities and providing for a nation. And we've given up that market share. And what is going on with the northern spotted owl is in direct breach of that act. And with that, I don't have much else to add that can be captured in the 5 minutes here. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nash. I appreciate you joining with us today and sharing some of your experiences and observations, and just as importantly, some of your thoughts of how we can fix this. I'd now like to recognize our final panelist, Mr. Heath Heikkila, who currently serves as the director for the American Forest Research Council. Mr. Heikkila served in the Bush administration, I'm assuming W, but it could have been HW, where he primarily focused on issues pertaining to the Endangered Species Act. So Mr. Heikkila, we're delighted that you're here with us and anxiously awaiting what you have to say.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chair Newhouse and Congressman Bentz. Thank you for the opportunity to share the perspectives of the American Forest Resource Council with you. AFRC is based in Portland, but we really focus on public forests in 5 Western states: California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And we have been engaged in the spotted owl issue since us or our predecessor associations ever since the listing in 1990. After almost 3 decades of experience, it's pretty clear that the federal laws and policies in place to protect and recover the northern spotted owl have failed. They have failed the owl, they failed our forests and other wildlife species, and of course, communities across the Pacific Northwest. After walking away from practicing any kind of proactive forestry on an overwhelming majority of 24 million acres of federal forests across the range of the northern spotted owl in those 3 states, the northern spotted owl continues to decline precipitously. We watch as millions of acres of federal lands have become overstocked and at risk to catastrophic wildfires, which char an increasing number of acres each year, threatening human lives and property, destroying habitat for the spotted owl and other species, fouling our air with toxic wildfire smoke each summer, threatening water supplies, and of course, emitting massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere at a time we're talking about reducing carbon emissions. The threat posed by these massive wildfires and competition from the barred owl require proactive action. Unfortunately, as well-intentioned as the Endangered Species Act and other federal laws are, they've simply just become weapons for those who wish to delay or stop activities, rather than taking proactive actions needed to address threats that do not match their ideological objectives. The tragic results of this broken system were on full display during the 2020 wildfire season. As you already referenced, 5 million acres burned in Oregon and California, in addition to in Washington. That represented about half of the acres burned nationwide, the 10 million acres, half burned in Oregon and California primarily. In California, the August complex burned nearly 1 million acres of forest across 5 Northern California counties, with about 40% of that acreage burned at a moderate to high intensity. In Oregon, the Forest Service estimates that about 360,000 acres of suitable spotted owl habitat burned during the Labor Day wildfires. That was 1 million acres in Western Oregon. According to the Forest Service data, nearly 200,000 acres of forest burned at such an intensity that it is no longer considered viable habitat for the spotted owl. If you look at the comparison between what was lost to harvest to now wildfire, it pales in comparison, as I noted in my written remarks. It would take nearly 35 years of timber harvest activities across the Pacific Northwest to impact the amount of spotted owl habitat that was destroyed in last year's wildfires in Western Oregon, to put it into context. So the numbers are huge. Sadly, attempts by the federal land management agencies to treat these forests to reduce wildfire risk are hampered by litigation, federal regulations, and bureaucratic gridlock. I've provided 2 recent examples of projects in my written remarks that include the Smoky Project in California that was subject to about a decade of planning, reconsultations under the Endangered Species Act, and litigation that started at the federal district court and worked its way to the circuit court, as well as the CCR project in Oregon on the Mount Hood National Forest. Both of these projects were delayed to the point that the fuels treatments were not implemented, and portions of the project areas actually burned last year in the wildfires in both Oregon and California, and we lost spotted owl habitat in those fires. So the situation is serious. I would flag a December 14th, 2020 comment letter the Department of Agriculture sent to Interior as it relates to the spotted owl critical habitat, where they essentially wrote the critical habitat designations for the NSO have unfortunately created challenges in recovery of the NSO. As such, USDA supports efforts to right-size the critical habitat footprint for the NSO and supports efforts to responsibly manage forests where appropriate to protect the NSO from catastrophic wildfire. As it was already referenced, on April 8th, Congressman Bentz led a letter with 8 of his colleagues, including you, Chair Newhouse, to the Interior Department, really asking that they do implement that rule to get to right size that critical habitat designation, including removing over 1 million acres of non-habitat, of acres that are not even occupiable by the owl that they have designated as critical habitat that have restricted fuels reduction and management activities. So I'll leave you with one other note. If in this area where we care about climate change, carbon emissions, last year, the 4 million acres that burned in California emitted over 91 metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is 25% more than the state's total emissions from fossil fuels. So, as we've already discussed, our current approach to not managing these forests is losing. And we really need to see the forest from the trees and understand that doing what's right for the forest will be good for the owl, and it'll be good for the other things we're trying to do out there on the landscape. So I appreciate the time to be with you today.
Great, thank you, Mr. Heikkila. Appreciate those comments and look forward to working with you on this issue. We're going to ask a few questions for a few minutes, each one of us, Cliff and I. So Mr. Bentz, I'll turn to you and let you get us started with our questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by asking all 3 of you, and we'll start with Commissioner Freeman first, then to Commissioner Nash, then to Mr. Heikkila. But the question is very simple. It's, if you were here in Congress, what would you do to address this gridlock that we see in getting into the forest? So I could ask you to go through more of the consequences of the gridlock, but I'd rather have you share with me what you see as a realistic way to get back into the woods. And so tell me what you suggest. What I'm really asking is, what do you suggest we do?
So thank you, Congressman Bentz. I appreciate the question. The fact is, the first thing to do is recognize there's a problem. And we're doing that today, and I really appreciate that. So often when we travel to Washington, D.C. and meet with members of Congress, they don't even realize or recognize there's a problem. And I think an awful lot of the time, the agencies and their communication to Congress fail to explain the situation or the difficulties of land management. One of the things that the Bureau of Land Management does the best here managing the ONC lands is their public information team can really make things sound good when they're really not that good. So again, I think the first thing is recognizing there's a problem. The second is we need to make sure we understand what Congress's goal is, right? Congress should have a goal of how they want lands managed. And in the ONC situation, it's the ONC Act. In other land designations, there's other outcomes that the Congress has designated for those lands. And then once that occurs, get the information from the land managing agencies as to what the problems are. They're doing your work for you. I mean, you're asking them as Congress to go do this. Ask them why it's not getting done, and then hold them accountable for that answer. And to me, I mean, I could talk about, you know, everything from the protest process to the you know, to the process of developing resource management plans, you know, to the crazy litigation that goes on and how these organizations use the Equal Access to Justice Act as much of a weapon as they do the Endangered Species Act. All those things are all tied together. I don't know that there's one thing I can tell you to do other than the fact that changing what we're doing now is got to happen. We can't keep doubling down on do more and more of the same thing. And that's just all that we ever see is more of the same thing. So, you know, in my written testimony, we do talk specifically about some situations that are occurring and give some examples. The rule that we worked with the Trump administration to change was a great tool to be fixed. All that rule change did was take the rule of putting the critical habitat designation by Fish and Wildlife out of areas where it did no good. On the ONC, the resource management plan, it already designates habitat. It did not need an additional designation of habitat. So I think, you know, there's some of its rule change, but honestly, I think Congress needs to step in and say, you know, where it's not working, we need to change it. Specific to the spotted owl, way back in the early 90s, the God Squad was formed to look at the spotted owl to say, hey, is this a species that can be recovered? Does it warrant being recovered? Is there the cost benefit analysis of that recovery? I think that needs to happen again. I mean, I think the science shows us that the spotted owl is breeding with other owls. I think every single plan we've seen, all the information we see shows the population's declining. Maybe this is one of those species that regardless of what humans do, it's not going to make it. But I think there has to be some bold moves.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Nash.
So one of the things that's already been touched on is equal access to justice. And when some of these lawsuits are thrown out there and they're proved to fail, there needs to be some consequences. It's just like Commissioner Freeman talked about. Every one of his sales that comes up on an ONC ground gets challenged. The same here in Wallowa County. It doesn't matter. We had one here recently that was a categorical exclusion, and it was identified by the governor's own map as a place where fuels reduction needed to be taken place because it was a safety corridor, it was a safety issue, and it was challenged. We ended up intervening as a county and going to the Ninth Circuit and won that case. But the people that brought the suit could still walk away with money. and that has to be broke. There's no reason not to sue at this point. And then I think we need to get down to community by community. In this valley, we grow about 80 million board feet a year. The aspirations of the local silviculturist here out of this district, he wants to get 5 million board feet made available each year. That's far too low. But can we come to an agreement with the Forest Service, with the tribes, with the community, with fisheries on what is an appropriate number, and then manage toward that and have it armored against lawsuits? And if we can do that, then I think we can get back in the woods and start managing again. But these long-term projects that end up getting litigated, we don't have any confidence that we can tell industry, yes, you can reinvest here again, because we have a steady flow of timber that's going to come to you. And so we have to solve that right up front.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Heikkila.
Well, thanks for the question. I guess my first response would be stop doing more harm. And so, for example, your colleagues in the Senate have a bill to actually overlay 1.5 million acres of Oregon forest with wild and scenic designations, which would make it more difficult to do management in those areas. So I think understanding as Congress looks to overlay more restrictions on these lands, we're going to make it more difficult, not less, to get out there and do fuels reduction. I think there's some real opportunity in the area of the consultation process between the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. There's been proposals in the past to allow on certain types of projects, the biologists for the Forest Service or the BLM to be able to make calls on certain, lower level projects and not have to go through the redundant process of a consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which adds time and delay to getting approved. So working those arrangements out between the agencies via legislation. Some sort of limits on litigation, and where I would focus is really on the process side of things. I referenced in my written testimony the Smoky projects. The litigants lost on 8 out of 10 counts in that litigation, but all it takes is hitting on one claim. In many cases, it's a process claim. It's did they consider X enough? It's not on is this project going to harm the environment? It's in their NEPA analysis. Did they adequately cover something? So how can we create a differentiation between those two moving forward? Finally, I think in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, there was a recognition of asking courts to recognize that there may be a short-term impact to the environment of a project, but to consider the long-term impact of not taking action, i.e. that wildfire in considering the project. Well, I believe it could make sense to do the same thing with the Endangered Species Act, because studies have shown, we have studies that clearly show that it's worth maybe a short-term impact to spotted owl habitat to reduce wildfire risk will be far better than not treating that forest and then losing hundreds of thousands of acres of spotted owl habitat in the next catastrophic wildfire. So those are some ideas, and we'd be happy to work with you on others.
Excellent ideas. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Bentz, and thank you all for those insightful answers. I've got a couple of questions myself, one for each of you. Short questions and don't have to be terribly long answers. I think they're pretty straightforward. So I'll just start with you, Mr. Nash. In your experience as serving as a county commissioner, just like if you could expand on the impacts that the northern spotted owl's critical habitat designation has had on some of the surrounding communities to you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, because we're not in that designated area. We're far east of there. And we actually thought that when the listing took place, that our timber might be worth more. And as it turned out, because we lost our market share in this greater area, we became more of a global market, and we saw a decline in timber prices, and it had a dramatic impact. So we had 3 sawmills here in the 1990s and previous, and had more than that previous to that. In 1994, I was working for Boise Cascade Sawmill when it shut down, and 54 of my friends, co-workers, lost their jobs. And it's a tough time. You're trying to raise 4 little kids, and you had a family wage job to go from that. And I don't regret my choice to go to the ranching job that I did, and the path that has taken place since. But I will tell you, my wages were cut in half overnight. And a lot of the co-workers ended up leaving. Our school population plummeted. And by 2003, all 3 sawmills that were going here were gone. And so on the periphery, it had devastating impacts.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That's those same kind of impacts were mirrored in many communities in my state as well. So, Mr. Heikkila, the American Forest Research Council, or excuse me, Resource Council, has put forth a number of suggestions regarding the management of the northern spotted owl. Could you just discuss some of those recommendations that the AFRC has put forth, and could you discuss some of the, my words, maybe not yours, but could you discuss some of the double standards we're seeing coming out of the Department of Interior?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, when you talk about the northern spotted owl, you really can't help but to talk about the barred owl and catastrophic wildfire at this point, because those are the 2 biggest threats to the owl. And even the Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes that. So number 1 recommendation would be to go in and thin these forests to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. And it is going to take a scale much, much greater than what we're accomplishing today, unfortunately. And this is not just a problem in the Northwest Forest Plan area, as you well know. It is a problem across the West. I was actually encouraged by a letter that Chair Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso sent to the President 2 days ago, where they really highlighted the problem that we have, and the how we're only treating about the 130,000 acres per year, or only about 0.2% of the 63 million acres classified as high or very high risk to catastrophic wildfire. So it would be really increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration. As it relates to the barred owl, Fish and Wildlife Service has clearly identified it as the other major threat. In my view, other than doing some minor pilots projects, really has not been serious about barred owl control. I think there are serious questions about whether that could be successful at all. I think Commissioner Freeman already kind of hit on the issue of, at some point, someone may need to make a decision, and how does that happen as it relates to natural selection and what took place? Did the barred owl just ultimately push the spotted owl out of many of these habitats, which has occurred in Washington state largely? The barred owl has largely pushed the northern spotted owl out of the state of Washington, and it's really not making progress there. So those are a couple of ideas. And one other idea to think about, Congressman Walden, your predecessor, Congressman Bentz, about 12 years ago introduced a bill trying to get at, what do we do after a fire, but let's figure it out before the fire. And I think that's another issue that makes a lot of sense in terms of doing the environmental analysis beforehand, so the decisions are made. Because right now, the big part of the reason why we don't do anything after a fire is because of the time it takes to get through the NEPA process and those processes to get projects approved. So that'd be another one that'd be worth taking a look at again, of what to do.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Heikkila. I appreciate that. Mr. Freeman, in your testimony, you mentioned the hardships the timber industry has felt, and as a result of the northern spotted owl listing. Could you discuss the impacts the timber industry has endured because of some of these mismanagement policies?
Well, certainly, and thank you for the question. Commissioner Nash got the question I wish you'd asked me, but it all sort of ties together. So, parts of the ONC areas of the counties and in parts of Oregon, the milling capacity is all but gone. Here in Douglas County, we still have a fair amount of milling capacity. However, the challenge really is to get timber. We've had several mills in the last few years shut down, and over the last 30 years, quite a few mills shut down. Each time a mill shuts down, you lose all those jobs that are associated with it, and all those families that live here and their kids go to school, and all the positive things that good employment creates are lost when you lose a mill. In Douglas County, we have really with the historical timber receipts, we're the #1 timber receiving county in the nation. So we're ground zero to this whole conversation you're talking about. On the ONC in perspective, in 1989, the payments to ONC counties was $109 million. In today's dollars, that's about $240 million. When the spotted owl was listed, and 30 years later, the timber receipts this last year would have been around 25 million. Those receipts come to counties to provide services to the citizens of the county, including that timber industry. So the timber industry, of course, those people that live here and work in the timber industry, they need county services like law enforcement, safe roads. Douglas County has lost half of the number of people that work for our county government. We've cut over half of that employment. And along with those lost mill jobs, I will tell you the listing of the northern spotted owl has been devastating to our community and to our timber industry. We have a very resilient and a very efficient and very innovative timber industry here in Douglas County and really in the West. They figure out how to make it through, but each one of these situations that happens makes it more and more difficult. These family-owned mills and generationally family-owned mills continue to struggle to find ways to be successful into the future and provide those incredibly important family wage jobs and a way of life here in our community. So again, thank you for the question. It's been very difficult for the timber industry, the impacts to those mills, those mill owners, and the jobs associated with them has been really difficult.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Freeman. We get that, Cliff and I get that, but it's important for other people to hear exactly what all three of you are saying. So appreciate your comments. Well, we're coming to the end of our discussion here. I want to truly express my appreciation for your participation. And before I give any closing remarks, I want to turn to Congressman Bentz to see if you'd like to give any final thoughts and thank our panelists. But so I'll turn it over to you for a few more minutes, Mr. Bentz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank you again, Sharon Newhouse, for arranging this gathering today. And I really do hope that the commissioners take the opportunity to get this out on social media so people can actually see it. We're going to do that and get these kinds of concepts out in front of people. I did hear last week that California in certain places is creating fire breaks around its cities in anticipation of what we hope doesn't happen, a terrible fire season. And I would just ask if those of you, all of you who live in forested areas are doing the same thing, and you might want to check into what's happening in California, because they are taking steps to try to protect their communities, and they're very aggressive steps, as I understand it. And so I've not checked this out on the ground, but I've heard it from two different reliable sources. And I just would say, having visited down in the Medford area, Grants Pass, and of course the drive back and forth from where I live, the incredible drought and the incredible dryness of things just really makes one worry about the communities that are surrounded by timber. So with that, you guys, thank you so much. Great seeing all of you again, and thank you for your thoughtful approach to this really challenging problem.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Benson. And let me add my voice of thanks to all of you as well. This has been a really enlightening conversation, one that truly goes with the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish. raise your voice so that other people understand the impacts of some of these policies and the mismanagement of what should be a very landmark piece of legislation, of law in the Endangered Species Act, something that we should be working very hard to make as good as it can be without negatively impacting the communities, as we've seen happen in Oregon, Washington, and California, as is the case with the northern spotted owl. But thank you very much for expressing to us how you've experienced this situation in your areas. I think it's very important. And thank you also for your great ideas on how we can move forward from here. Actions Congress can take, policies that we should be looking at to do a better job of working with the Endangered Species Act to accomplish the original goals that were set out, and that is to bring species back and celebrate victories where we can, but also not to endanger the very communities where we live. So thank you very much for your contributions today, and I very much look forward to working with you and also with you, Congressman Bentz, on these issues that are very important to our states. Thank you all.